Earth warned the galaxy one last time. They ignored it. The Vanguard flagship Zenthorian Prime shuddered. No target vector, no kinetic flash, no defensive fleet. Warlord Malakirvex gripped the command rail as the forward viewplates groaned under non-kinetic shear stress. The structural frame screamed, metal sheared without impact. The outer hull plates buckled inward, pressurized by an invisible wall that compressed the ship's massive frame like tinfoil. The tactical grid died in sequence, leaving the bridge crew in absolute darkness as the secondary emergency lights flared to life with a low, rhythmic pulse. The main propulsion drives backed up into the cooling loops, sending violent tremors through the deck plates that threw the officers from their stations. Navigation arrays went dark. The deck plates vibrated with a sharp, dragging frequency that shook the boots of every officer on the bridge. Malakirvex spat green blood onto the primary instrumentation console. The spatial grid had turned into solid stone around them. The fleet had crossed the invisible line, and the vacuum itself was pushing back with crushing weight. He pounded his fist against the auxiliary communications relay, demanding status reports from the flanking cruisers, but the only response was the crackle of localized cosmic radiation and the deep, grinding groan of tearing structural bulkheads. The entire Vanguard had run into an invisible wall at full combat velocity. In the Sapphire Hall, thousands of light years away, High Counselor Corvale slammed his ivory staff into the stone floor to call the Great Assembly to order. The grand legislative hubris of the core systems filled the air with a low, confident hum. They were there to formally ratify the non-negotiable annexation of the human border sectors. For 300 years, the silent territory had remained empty. The Assembly misread that long silence as baseline defensive absence, a primitive species hiding in fear behind their cold stars. The politicians smiled beneath their silk robes, whispering about the vast mineral wealth waiting to be harvested from the undefended systems beyond the perimeter. Ambassador Tilara stepped into the cold stone well of the hall. She did not look at the packed galleries. She held the oxide-coated ledger sheet containing the ancient boundary text document recovered from the lowest archives. She raised her voice, registering a final historic archive warning against crossing the coordinates of Vector Omega. The core systems had ignored the perimeter for generations, treating the old markers as administrative artifacts left behind by a forgotten age. She warned the Assembly that the boundary was not a political line, but a physical barrier with active defense systems that had remained dormant only because no Imperial fleet had ever dared to violate the coordinate limits. Warlord Malakirvex appeared on the central holoprojection, his transmission originating from the edge of the human sector just minutes before the spatial collapse. He laughed at Tilara, his massive tusks catching the amber glare of the Assembly lights. He activated the military transmission decree right there before the voting bodies, formally reducing the human timeline to a few operational minutes. The decree passed instantly, overriding the ancient warning with a unanimous legislative chime that echoed through the high vaults of the hall. The politicians cheered, throwing their paper ledgers into the air as the war fleets received the automated command to cross the perimeter line at maximum speed. Deep inside the ice-insulated steel bulkheads of the lower vault on a nameless asteroid, High Admiral Raymond Drake stood before a physical brass terminal key. The room smelled of hot copper filings and grease-stained radiator grids. The oxide-coated rail-gauge wrench sat on the console, pinning down loose paper log sheets. Drake checked the tactical display. The Zenthorian Vanguard fleet had just crossed the perimeter boundary into Vector Omega. The target icon flashed a steady, bright amber against the dark green background of the old cathode ray monitor. He adjusted his headset, listening to the static hum of the deep space sensors tracking the enemy movements. Drake reached out with a calloused palm and gripped the cold, cross-hatched metal of the brass terminal key. His right earlobe was missing a clean section from an old orbital construction line accident decades ago. He did not hesitate. He rotated the physical key into the locked position, closing the high-voltage physical grid loop manually. The heavy mechanical relays behind the steel walls dropped with a dull, echoing thud that shook the dust from the overhead ventilation pipes. The system accepted the manual authorization, sending a massive surge of direct current through the underground power conduits toward the deep space transmitters arrayed across the asteroid surface. Across the system's outer perimeter, millions of kilometers away, the signal reached the subsurface deployment networks. System operator Cole sat in an isolated control bunker 3 levels below the ice, his fingers flying across a mechanical input array. He monitored the energy flow as the command pulse traveled through the deep spatial grid. The silent networks that had slept for 300 years began to draw power directly from the stellar core. Cole checked the voltage stabilization meters. watching the needles climb into the red zones as the subsurface arrays began to project their fields into the path of the oncoming alien fleet. Cole confirmed the rapid realignment of 18,000 subsurface gravimetric nodes planted throughout the border zone. The nodes did not fire plasma or launch missiles. They simply shifted their physical polarity. The cometary buoys changed their internal rotation, locking onto each other in a massive web of synchronized mass generators. The space between the nodes began to stiffen, thickening the vacuum itself into a dense kinetic trap that altered the fundamental metrics of local space. The energy signature from the node alignment created a massive gravitational shear zone that completely blocked all egress vectors, locking the Imperial ships into their current trajectories. Back on the flagship, Navigation Officer Zalcor screamed as his panels flashed bright amber. The warp lanes were backing up into the primary cooling loops. The ship's engines were pushing forward at maximum speed, but the spatial drag had increased instantly. The Vanguard fleet was running into a wall made of the universe itself. Every capital hull in the formation began to twist under its own forward momentum. The navigation computers tried to calculate emergency exit vectors, but the processing units melted under the strain of handling impossible spatial metrics that defied their core programming parameters. The structural failure metrics spiked across the entire Vanguard simultaneously. Zalcor reported immediate localized hull failures as the warp lanes collapsed inward. The ships could not drop out of faster-than-light travel because the space ahead of them was no longer capable of bending to accommodate their distortion fields. The energy tore through the stabilization fields, ripping the support struts from the main hulls and exposing the internal crew compartments to the raw pressure of the shifting space. The outer armor plating peeled away like paper, dragged off by the immense friction of the thickening vacuum. Warlord Malakirvex watched the tactical grid dissolve into static. His Vanguard flagship began to break apart piece by piece as the internal structural frames collapsed under the intense physical strain. The local spatial density had shifted by 400% within a second of the key rotation. The sheer kinetic force of their own velocity was crushing them from the inside out, turning their massive dreadnought into a self-inflicted weapon of mass destruction. The reinforced command viewport snapped with a crystalline crack under the intense non-kinetic shear stress, spraying shards of synthetic glass across the command deck. The secondary cruisers behind the flagship fared no better. Their hulls buckled, their thrusters tore free from their mounts, and their internal atmospheric seals blew out into the black vacuum as the spatial compression loop reached its peak intensity. The entire military Vanguard, the absolute pride of the core systems, was being systematically reduced to broken scrap metal without a single human weapon being fired. The space around Vector Omega had turned into a giant industrial press that ground steel, titanium, and living tissue into a uniform cloud of floating debris that choked the stars. Inside the lower vault, Raymond Drake watched the green lines on his monitor flatten out completely. The 14 minutes of total spatial distortion played out on his screen in absolute silence, recorded by the automated sensor pickets stationed along the perimeter line. He did not cheer. He did not smile. He picked up the rail gauge wrench from the desk, checking the weight against his calloused palm before hooking it back onto his heavy leather belt loop. The machine had done exactly what it was built to do, executing the ancient defensive parameters with cold, mechanical perfection. Operator Cole looked up from his console as the node's status indicators returned to a stable, dark blue standby mode. The energy drain stopped. The 18,000 nodes settled back into the ice, invisible to the rest of the galaxy once more as their internal cooling systems bled off the excess thermal energy generated during the deployment sequence. The physical grid loop opened automatically, the brass key clicking back to its neutral position with a small metallic snap that echoed in the quiet vault. The automated diagnostic routines began running their post-activation cycles, checking for cable degradation. The destruction of the fleet was total. The Zenthorian Vanguard left behind no survivors, no operational escape pods, and no salvageable technology for the Empire to recover. The spatial density returned to its normal state, leaving the shattered capital hulls floating as a silent field of frozen iron dust at the edge of the human border sectors. The human territory remained completely dark, offering no broadcast, no explanation, and no formal declaration of war to the core worlds. The empty space simply closed back up, swallowing the remnants of the invasion force as if they had never existed. Drake turned back to the main communication console to complete the final protocol required by his standing orders. He took the unedited 14 minutes of raw destruction telemetry from the grid monitors and loaded it into a single outbound transmission file. He did not add a long explanation. He did not write a warning manifesto. He simply attached the three-word text file to the front of the massive telemetry package and targeted the transmitter directly at the main receiver array located in the Sapphire Hall. He pressed the broadcast button with a flat impact of his thumb against the rubberized transmit switch. The data burst cleared the system antenna, racing across the galaxy toward the Great Assembly at maximum broadcast power. Drake grabbed his heavy insulated coat from the wall hook, pulled it over his broad shoulders, and walked toward the vault exit without looking back at the monitors. His boots clicked against the industrial metal floor plates as the lights behind him dimmed down to low power standby mode. In the Sapphire Hall, High Counselor Corvale was listening to a minor report on resource allocation when the main projector overrode the legislative display without authorization. The hum of the thousands of assembly members died instantly as the raw telemetry stream began to play across the massive display screens. The images showed the pride of their military force breaking apart like dry twigs in the dark, their structural frames bending and snapping under the weight of an invisible, crushing force. The assembly watched the 14 minutes of absolute erasure in complete, frozen horror as the sensor data detailed the destruction of every single vessel. No plasma trails, no explosive ordnance, no human ships. There was nothing but the mathematical proof of space itself turning into a solid wall and grinding the fleet into dust. The grand legislative hubris of the Empire evaporated in the cold light of the display panels, replaced by a sudden, choking realization of their own complete vulnerability. The three-word text file opened automatically on the giant central screen above the counselor's seat, flashing once before locking into a solid display. The words were plain, taken directly from the 300-years-old archive document that the Assembly had dismissed as a primitive relic before authorizing the invasion force. The text did not contain a threat, but the galaxy's highest ruling body sat completely paralyzed before it, their political ambitions shattered by the realization of the boundary's true nature. High Counselor Corvale looked down at his trembling hands, the ivory staff slipping from his fingers and clattering loudly onto the stone platform. The grand annexation plans were gone, replaced by the reality of an unyielding border that could never be crossed by any fleet they could ever assemble. The assembly remained silent as the final telemetry stream ended, leaving nothing but the text on the screen to illuminate the darkened hall where the leaders of the galaxy sat frozen in fear. Far out on the nameless asteroid, the heavy steel vault doors slid shut with a deep mechanical groan, sealing the lower control layers beneath meters of solid rock and ice. High Admiral Raymond Drake walked out into the cold hangar bay, his breath pluming in the freezing air as he prepared his transport ship for the long journey back to the inner core worlds. He adjusted his gloves, his thoughts already turning to the routine maintenance schedules that would be required to prepare the grid for the next deployment. The ancient boundary text document lay forgotten on the floor of the Sapphire Hall, where the ambassador had dropped it during the initial panic. The oxide-coated metal sheet sat quiet under the pale blue lights of the empty well, their stamped letters reflecting the glow of the central screen that still displayed the three-word message sent from the darkness. The legislative hall remained dark, the silent stone floor holding the dropped metal ledger sheets.